Some folks are still rolling in the door, but in the interest of all this activity that we have this afternoon, one presentation after another, I am going to begin. My name is Stephen Budd, and I'm going to introduce our two speakers for this session. But first, I have been asked to once again tell you that this year's festival is made possible by the generous support of our donors. BCTV, Bobby Bristol, the Family Foundation Works, the Vermont Arts Council, the Vermont Community Foundation, and Vermont Humanities Council, and Vermont Public Radio. This particular presentation has been brought to you by the Stepansky Family Charitable Trust. We'd like you also to thank our advertisers and encourage you to support them. Books are for sale in the lobby as you passed on the way in, and there's also a donation container there to help us defray the costs of the festival. So if you would be so kind, we would appreciate that. As a former educator and student of leadership, I've long held Thomas Jefferson as the example of progressive and uniquely American political thought. Jefferson was a man who embraced science and reason as drivers of human progress. He was a true polymath, embracing music, art, mathematics, and language. And perhaps the best example of what we know today as the liberally educated person. Yet, like many students of history, I've been troubled at times by the incongruities and the seeming paradox between the thoughts of our leaders and sometimes their actions and sometimes the way that they have lived their lives. Figures that we hold in high esteem. As I began the book, I was reminded of a recent issue of Smithsonian Magazine. Maybe you had seen it in the last year. It was an issue that was dedicated to Thomas Jefferson. And I found myself troubled by the discussion of slaveholding. The magazine, I felt, was almost damning of Jefferson. And it left me personally very wanting and needing to reconcile that dissonance I was feeling between my admiration for this man and the uncomfortable facts about his way of life. In our current political climate, exposés of the foibles and even worse, the character flaws of our leaders has become a popular sport, leaving us little in the way of true edification and understanding. In their book, Most Blessed of Patriarchs, Gordon-Reed and Onuff rise above the all too common formula of characterizing their subject as either angel or demon, or a person who can be trusted, or a damned liar. Rather, they seek to reconcile the ambitions of a man who they see as a seeker of truth, even with his self-deceptions. They acknowledge Jefferson as a man more gifted than most, but complicated, just like the rest of us. We have with us two distinguished scholars of Jefferson, Annette Gordon-Reed, the author, a National Book Award winner and Pulitzer Prize winning, the Hemingses of Monticello. She is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and the Carol K. Pforzheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard University. Peter Onuff is the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor Emeritus at the University of Virginia and Senior Research Historian at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. I give you Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuff.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming out on this beautiful, beautiful day.
We're having a bit of trouble hearing in the back.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I'm wondering if the person could maybe get mics a little bit stronger.
Hello.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. We're all set. I'm sorry, it was my fault, not the mic's fault or the tech person's fault. It's wonderful to be here on this beautiful day. Thank you for coming out. This is interesting for us because we've never done dueling pulpits before. We'll see how this goes. We're usually sitting at chairs, talking to each other very conversationally. We'll try to be conversational in our pulpit presentation today.
Yeah,
Yes.
I've got a few sermons prepared for you.
No, you don't want to hear that. Don't want to hear that. No, it's great to be here. We were trying to talk about what it is. We sort of do this in a freewheeling fashion, and the best part of all of this is to be able to get your questions, which I gather we'll be able to do, right?
For sure.
For sure, that's the best part of it all. To talk a little bit about how we came to do this. So much has been written about Jefferson. You mentioned the Smithsonian article, and that was one that sort of rattled a number of people, in ways that they had not imagined in thinking about Jefferson as a slaveholder. We had problems with that particular presentation, and we weren't addressing that particularly in our book, but we gave our vision of Jefferson in Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, and we think it gives a more rounded view of what was going on at Monticello.
Yeah.
See, this works.
Okay, we got this really worked out. It's very smooth. Okay, all right. This is call and response?
Call and response, yes, exactly. It's perfect for a church.
I'll respond. The challenge that we saw was to move beyond the binary oppositions that Steve talked about, to show the whole man, to make him coherent and consistent, not necessarily someone we agree with about a lot of things. His world was not a kind of world that we want to restore when we make America great again. All right. Oh, this is a great crowd. I love it. And to be in church and have people applaud, I mean, it's just, what could be better?
No, not much.
Anyway, our challenge was to get beyond the cheap shots. And much of our present-day political discourse consists of cheap shots. And it's very satisfying to think of one of the founders as being deeply flawed, because what does that make us? Well, we are the people who make the judgment. We're speaking from pulpits. We're moralizing about the past, and that's fine until we become the past and we become the objects of moralizing. So I would say our big challenge has been to try to overcome the cheap shot of hypocrisy. It's so easy to say this, and I am now wearing the Declaration of Independence. He says things in the Declaration right here on this tie. Actually, this is just signatures, I'm exaggerating, that he doesn't live up to. And that's, of course, the standard charge. Oh, all men are created equal, and you owned how many slaves?
Over 700 over the course of his life.
That was pretty smooth. I mean, we got going, we're fine.
I just have to remember to keep looking at you, though. That's the thing.
So, Annette, why don't you deliver on your promise to share with our friends, because they seem very friendly, how we came to this project, why we did it together, why would two people like us find a common ground with this man, or on this man?
Okay, well, we'd been friends for a very, very long time. Peter was instrumental in helping me get my first manuscript published, Thomas Jefferson and Sally, Hemingses, An American Controversy. That was long, long ago. And we've been having this conversation about Jefferson for a long time. And we come to a point where we thought that things had sort of run into a ditch. Hypocrisy, the charge of hypocrisy, sort of offered up as a way of stopping all the discussion about Jefferson, and you can't think about how this person became who he was. Why was he someone who was admired, in some ways also hated by a number of people? How did this figure get to be who he was, and something beyond this notion of how he was not living up to our particular standards at this moment, to look at him in a historical fashion. And so I thought, well, why don't we, Peter's an intellectual historian, he says this quite a bit with, I think, some chagrin, but he might be joking about it. But if you Google Peter Onuff, the picture comes up and he's described as a biographer. Well,
I don't do people.
you don't do people at all.
And I don't even consider Jefferson a person.
We don't do people at all. He's an intellectual historian, and I do social history and political history. He does some political history as well, but they're differing. It's the same different discipline, but different parts of it. And so we thought, what would it be like if two people who had been looking at Jefferson from different aspects, the intellectual side of Jefferson, and also from my side, looking at slavery, the institution of slavery at Monticello and in Virginia, looking at Jefferson as a person, what I know about his personal life and private life, and if we looked at things together. This is something that happens occasionally in the historical profession, but most historians, like most writers, go off on their own and do their own thing, and your own little garret, and doing your own research and so forth, and pulling forth your own individual genius. That's the goal. That is the idea of what is behind scholarship, the way it is typically done. We wanted to do something different. I don't know that we set out, or I don't know that I set out to make a sort of statement about the future of scholarship, the importance of interdisciplinary work. We're not separate disciplines, but we are separate fields within a discipline, pooling resources in the way that scientists do. I mean, and the way other people do, work collaboratively on a particular project. We were able to do this because we like each other. We basically agree. It would be, I think, much more difficult if we had it would have taken us much longer if we had really, really sharp disagreements about things. And people ask us when been on the tour and we're interviewed, people ask us, well, how did you actually do this? How did you overcome this sort of the lone singular person, at their desk writing? He wrote sections of the book and send it to me, and I'd look at it, rewrite parts of it. I'd draft sections, send it back to him. He'd look at it, rewrite it, to the point in which you really don't know, other than in a few parts where all writers have tics. They have their own individual quirky styles. I might recognize mine in looking at that, and I might recognize his. But overall, I don't know most of the time who wrote what, because parts of the sentences are his, parts of the sentences are mine. And once he was talking about a particular passage and said, well, this is good, but I think I would try it this way and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, you wrote that. And he'd forgotten that he had written that, because probably some of the words might have added some words or moved things around a little bit. But that's what our editor wanted. He wanted one voice. He didn't want, a lot of times people do this, one person will take a chapter, the other person will take another chapter, and you can tell. Now, Gordon Witt claimed that he could tell who had written what. I think
he knows better than we do.
He knows better than we do. Gordon always knows best. But I think that's probably not the case, because a lot of times things that we had each other write the thing that the other person would be expected to write. Do you know what I mean? So you do the music chapter. I think people would probably, I don't know, because I'm a girl, I don't know, people would say, oh, she probably did the music chapter. Well, he started that out. That is his basic draft. And then I came along and did different things, and vice versa. We sort of took on each other's persona, others' interests, and wrote about it, and then sort of melded things together. So that's one thing that people are very interested in when we're going around talking, is how do two people work together? But I think, and I think we both think, that this might be the future in some ways. Young people are being taught now to work collaboratively, not as individually, because I think it enhances things.
Well, it's the future. I think you're right, and it's also, in my case, the past. I'm a serial collaborator, but the collaboration ends here.
He's promiscuous.
It is very gratifying not to be able to know who wrote what, because anything anybody says is, in one way or another, part of a conversation. And when we extract our bits from the conversation in our discipline, the conversation around us, then we're presenting it as if it were wholly ours when it's not. So there's something honest about this. We're blending in a way that reflects the way the discipline has progressed, the way our knowledge has progressed, and certainly this is true in the sciences. But history, the humanities are the last bastion for the petty bourgeoisie, that is the small shopkeeper, and that illusion of autonomy and independence, which is crucial to our national mythology, is very important. What we might be doing with this conversation that we're sharing with you today is returning to a notion of collaboration that defines the American founding itself, a conversation among patriots. Now, I'm not getting patriotic now, don't mistake me, because you're going to hear a lot of nasty stuff about Jefferson over the course of the next few minutes. But the idea that you need to relate to others in a way, that is the genius of democracy itself. So that's our patriotic spin on what we've done.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think we succeeded.
It's pretty good?
I think it's pretty good. I think that mirrors the notion of a conversation, because that's what it's been between the two of us. And we basically agree on premises, but there were some points of disagreement, but it required us to work through them. It required, in some ways,
so when did we ever disagree?
sublimating ego. When did we ever disagree? Well, we disagreed about Jefferson and religion.
Here we are in a house of
Here we are in a
worship.
house of, I thought that this was especially appropriate to bring up. Jefferson is seen as someone who was, by some people, almost consider him to have been an atheist, but certainly someone who was skeptical of religion. My home state in Texas wanted to take him out of the history books. And you laugh.
They got a lot of Federalists down there, right? With a small f.
With a small f. Wanted to take him out of the history books because of his belief that Jesus was not a divine being, that Jesus was a human being who was the greatest moral teacher, he said, who ever lived, but was not a person who performed miracles, was not a person who rose from the dead. Jesus was a good guy. Jesus was somebody who should be followed, but not a divine being. And of course, that's problematic where I come from. And the idea was to not take him totally out, but they had a section where they would sort of highlight people, great figures of the Enlightenment, and they decided to replace him with John Calvin.
What an enlightened character he was.
Yes, an enlightened character, that noted American, and Thomas Aquinas. So without Jefferson out of the forefront of American figures of the Enlightenment, and out of the history books in a way, and of course that's problematic because of his religious views. And I had come to this thinking that Jefferson was, to the extent that he talked about religion, he was doing it sort of paying lip service to the idea, and was not only skeptical but perhaps hostile to religion. I didn't think that he was an atheist, but he called himself a Christian. And he wrote, or actually when he sort of cuts up the Bible and makes his Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, which is called the Jefferson Bible, he says that he thinks it's going to show that he is a true Christian, a primitive Christian, a Christian of the old school, a person who followed Jesus's teachings in ways that people who had mystified, he said, mystifications, the way that priests and people who wanted to control other individuals used religion. So I'm a United Methodist, and there's certainly.
And I'm a lapsed Unitarian.
Yes, and I always say at this point, how do you know? How can you tell? So I had this real problem with this idea of somebody saying that he was a Christian when he didn't believe. I don't say that I believe all of the things that are there as well, but I'm not, literal. But I understand that there are certain tenets of Christianity that are sort of a lot of baseline things. And I was sort of resistant to the idea that he should be allowed to call himself a Christian. And he pushed back from that, and in ways that were ultimately persuasive.
Yeah, it's because I'm a devout lapsed Unitarian. I think what we recovered and the discussions we had were about what you might call Jefferson's sense of wonder at the world and the creator and the creation. And we now take science to be disenchanting, demystifying, the antithesis of a faithful embrace of the Godhead. But if you look at God's creation and you try to discern the laws of nature, those are God's laws, and conform to them as much as possible, you could advance the larger project, which is God's project, and that's the progress of the race. We have to understand the world, and in a period when very little was understood about the world, and the magnificence of creation in that sense that it all makes sense. It's lawful. It's accessible to human reason through the generations, not for any one man at any one time, but in the future. That idea of progress is very much a testament to Jefferson's faith in humanity. And it's a faith in humanity that goes back to the teachings of Jesus, which describe a religion and ethics for humanity. And I think it's that sense of wonder and the power. And also, this is what got me going on Jefferson being a religious person. He believed in an afterlife. Try to process that for a little bit. He was a philosophical materialist. What that meant was everything that exists always exists in some form, and that enabled him to imagine in his late life correspondence with John Adams that they would meet in heaven. And that was someplace above the world. Now, he knows that that's just a projection. He knows that's a kind of fantasy, but it's also a meaningful one. I think it's something he believes in, he has faith in. This idea of coming back together with all the people you've lost, and the number of people who died on Jefferson, the fact that these two old men lived so long, and they'd seen so much, and though they hadn't been with each other since Adams skulked away at Jefferson's inauguration, they hadn't seen each other, but they would see each other again, because the bonds they had formed in Paris, in Philadelphia, earlier in their careers, those would endure beyond time. And in that future state, Jefferson and Adams would look down and see what would happen to the progress of this earth, despite the rivers of blood that had flown in the wake of the French Revolution. Maybe one day the design that Jefferson thought was imminent in nature would be fulfilled, and humanity would prosper in the way surely a just God had ordained.
And what that requires you to do to understand that is to take Jefferson at his word, which is something that hasn't been done for a very, very long time. There's sort of a game that people play. Well, I get you. I understand what you're doing. I'm on to you. You don't really mean that. You're trying to trick us and so forth, in the way people look at Jefferson through the historiography. And if you look at him as a person, and we say this in the book, we try to, and we use this caveat, whenever it is at all reasonable, not all the time, but we try to take Jefferson at his word, that the things that he is saying, if we don't have objective evidence to the contrary, are things that he actually believes, that these are his motivations. Because we're trying to recover in the book not what we think Jefferson ought to have been doing in the world, but what he thought he was doing in the world. That is much more interesting. All the things that we think should be going on in the world, we could do in another essay. You know, the Annette Gordon-Reed essay, the Peter Onuff essay, here's what we ought to be doing. But to do that through the life of a person who lived long ago, and whose life that you take the responsibility of trying to explicate, we don't think is fair. It's the way to do it. It makes it about us. Now, a lot of writing is always about us, but it makes it more explicitly and more clearly about us if it's all about what we think Jefferson ought to be doing, and a way of signaling to our fellow citizens, contemporary citizens, how great we are, how enlightened we are, and what we know, as opposed to what this man who never saw a train did not know. And so that's the purpose, and you can do that, and that's what I was doing before, the sort of old way, looking at him with respect to religion in particular, because of my own personal beliefs and understandings, and saying, you don't really believe that. You're just trying to convince this posterity that he knew would be out there, but he did not know the particular contours of. you're trying to trick us in some fashion. So the kind of thing that Peter is talking about, the kind of things we do in the book, are designed to move beyond that, to try to tell people that this is who this individual was, as best as we can understand, by looking at his words. A lot of the research is their letters, they're Jefferson's letters. We do some secondary material, mainly our own stuff, but most of it is looking at the papers of Thomas Jefferson and trying to recover and see what he thought he was doing and present it to people.
The idea of putting a subject of biography in a context or a world that's unfamiliar to us, that's what you read biographies for to some extent. You want an inspiring story of a life, but then you want the merchant in ivory local color. You want the interior decoration. You want to get a feeling to imagine that you're there. But you imagining you're there is projecting a self, a 21st century self. Most of us are really hopelessly lost in the 20th century, onto the 18th or 19th century. To complete our project, we had to interrogate not just the context, but Jefferson's sense of himself, how he constructed a coherent idea of who he was in that world. So it's not just that the past is a foreign country, the very idea of the individual who moves through that world is historically determined. And that's what we're trying to explore here.
Yes, well, and the title of the book, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. That's the other thing that people ask us about, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs. We had sort of a fight with the publisher about this. Not a fight, that's too strong a word, but there was some concern about Most Blessed of the Patriarchs because people thought that it sounded too much like a religious figure. I mean, you think of some person, sitting on a mountain with a staff and, looking out over his fields and so forth. And we got this title from a letter that Jefferson wrote to Angelica Schuyler Church, who was the sister-in-law of Alexander Hamilton that Jefferson met, who met her while he was in Paris. And he writes to her when he has been in Washington's cabinet and has been bested by his rival, Alexander Hamilton, though he doesn't mention this in the letter, of course, saying that he's about to go home and he's sort of envisioning this world as it will be when he gets there, and talks about, I have my fields to form, and he's going to watch for the happiness of those who labor for his, namely enslaved people. That's his vision. And he says, if my daughters join me and they marry and everything, he says, I will consider myself as blessed as the most blessed of the patriarchs. And so this is not us calling him the most blessed of the patriarchs. This is Jefferson's view of himself. And we thought that was really interesting because here is the apostle of democracy. Here's the avatar of the Enlightenment, a person who sees himself, who is a deep investment right. in seeing himself as a progressive among people, likening himself to a figure of old from ancient times. And there's another letter in which he describes himself as living as an antediluvian patriarch at Monticello. And we think, antediluvian patriarch? This is the apostle. He's the Jacobin, the person who's supposed to be destroyer of worlds and so forth, and the harbinger of the new. Why is he calling himself this? And because he was a patriarch. And patriarch is a word that, at the time, as Peter suggests, was not bad. It was not considered an evil thing to be a patriarch.
No, and I think that's the secret, or the way to gain understanding, is to come up against something that doesn't make sense. How could the apostle of democracy see himself as a patriarch? How could we see democracy as a world in which patriarchs consent to be governed by the rule of law, that they create this thing, the United States of America? That's a very alien idea. It privileges, of course, white males, and we'll get to the white part later. And everything that seems progressive is when you look inside at the plantation, at the mountain, at his domain, seems to be so oriented to the past. What a paradox that is, that our ideas of democracy are grounded, and I use that word advisedly because the ground is so important, the land is so important, in this ancient idea of the connection of man to land, that the family form is natural. We're talking about nature all the time. The Enlightenment is trying to discern the laws of nature. And this is the natural way that humans form families, and then societies are families of families. That notion now is, of course, extremely strange to us because we live in a world that fetishizes the individual, extracted from the family. Even if we spend a temporary sojourn within the nuclear family, we're on our way out, and those nuclear families are blasting apart all the time. So what is this about the family form being normative? But it's natural, not just because that's the way it's always been, but because the household itself is the basic unit of economic production. This is where things happen. So the idea of these autonomous units conjoined by the consent of the patriarchs to a rule of equality, all those things that we cherish in the American tradition, those things constitute each other. They're part of the same phenomenon. That's what's strange about this foreign country, the America of Jefferson's time.
And it's strange to us. And when you add slavery to the mix, the institution
That's
of
beyond
slavery,
strange.
That's beyond strange. It's just unfathomable to people to understand how a person who wrote very eloquently about the evils of slavery could nevertheless continue to be a slave owner. And we take the position in the book that Jefferson did believe that slavery was an evil institution, even though he did not have the emotional capacity, the will, however you want to describe it, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, to rid himself of this institution. This is something that bounded him. We talk about the fact that it bounded him from the beginning of his days until the very end. We tell the story about Jefferson's claimed first memory, being handed up on a pillow to an enslaved person to make a trip when he's a baby, when he's a young child. And then at the end of his life, having an enslaved man, Burl Colbert, lift him up higher on the pillows when he asked to have this done, and nobody else in the room, his daughters and grandchildren, nobody knew what he was saying except Burl Colbert, the person who was close to him, probably the closest to him at the end of his life, knew what to do, and he lifts him up, and then not long after that, Jefferson dies. So the first person that he saw, and one of the last people that he saw, was an enslaved person. And we could think about, not by way of making an excuse, because that's not what we're in the business of, but if you're trying to understand an individual, what that meant to live in a society like that, where enslaved people were everywhere, were part of your life, made your life, he benefited from this. He benefited from this institution, not just, well, not even that much materially, because Monticello was not really a profitable place, and he died bankrupt, but emotionally, you think about the emotional nature of all of this, the affective side of slavery, which, you know, we dismiss because what ends up happening after Jefferson dies is that this feeling, this impulse is turned into, you know, an apology for slavery. I mean, Jefferson in the revolutionary generation talked about slavery as a necessary evil that would die, and then by the time Jefferson is dying as an elderly man, the times had begun to change. People were beginning to formulate a philosophy that slavery was a positive good. And it was a positive good because of, you know, African American people, Africans were naturally suited to being enslaved, and the slave system itself was a family institution, a domestic family institution in which there were these affective ties. Talk about love. If you want to drive people crazy, African Americans crazy, talk about, you know, the love in the plantation system, like, what? Who cares? I mean, love, where you're keeping people in bondage, where you are depriving people of their natural rights and so forth. So Jefferson has this kernel of this is definitely in his understanding about slavery. It is an institution that means something to him, not only economically, but it bounds his entire life. And we try to tease out how this works for him and why it made him not a likely candidate to being someone who was going to lead a slave revolt. As though it's what people thought in the 1790s, which is crazy. Some of the people who were his enemies, Jefferson was seen as this sort of, you know, firebrand, and was for his time a progressive, but he was not ever going to lead a slave revolt just because he said slavery was wrong. And we talk a little bit about how that happened, how he failed to do that.
Right. The real tension Jefferson's life, and I'm not bringing back the notion of hypocrisy or contradiction, he lived with, and he lived comfortably with this tension, is between his emotional investment in his family, his white family, his legal acknowledged family, and in the larger family of his slaves, and as Annette has brilliantly showed, the gray area in which his mixed race children, that family existed, the so-called shadow family. That investment is not just a pro-slavery sentimentalism, which is what Annette properly derided. It's instead, at least as Jefferson understands it, a sense of stewardship or responsibility that is historically associated with rule. The monarch, the king, protects his or her subjects, and allegiance is owed in return. And that's not simply transactional. That is a profound bond that organizes human society. And that notion of hierarchy organization, that organic whole of the family, survives on the plantation even while Jefferson and fellow planters and farmers and merchants are reconstructing the way the polity will be organized. Jefferson never forgets, even when pro-slavery is beginning to take hold, that slavery is a radical injustice. This is the larger tension. How do you resolve that injustice? And until you do resolve it, how do you deal with your responsibility to the human beings you own? And that notion of responsibility or stewardship, I think, is an important dimension that we need to add to the idea of equality, which is the powerful idea we take away that speaks to us today. But what's missing in our modern libertarian accounts of equality is a sense of reciprocity or responsibility, whether that's among equals or superordinates and subordinates, heads of family, family members. Jefferson's major testimony, his commitments in politics, are to foster a regime among equals of love and attachment that would sustain the republic, and across generations, the responsibility that the living generation has to its successors. Rather than being a license to be anything you want to be, he sees equality and freedom in the republic as a threshold of performing the fundamental acts that make us humans in providing for the welfare of our families, black and white, and for a future generation of families. That is a dimension that's stripped away. And one of our goals in this book was to try to recover the sources of that understanding of his world and his role in it. That is, you can't separate the private from the public. You can't separate his life as a slaveholder from his life as the author of My Necktie. They are inextricably linked, and that's our challenge here. Earlier biographers, writers like Merrill Peterson, have said, you'll never figure out Thomas Jefferson's impenetrable, or as Joseph Ellis said, he's a sphinx. You won't ever know him, or you just give up and say, he just doesn't make sense. As Ellis also said, he's Pol Pot. He's a terrorist because he embraces the French Revolution. Well, all of this reflects, interestingly, on our times, the times in which we write, but tells us nothing about Jefferson's time.
And even the things that we can't accept, this notion of stewardship over the African-American family, that's abhorrent to us. We don't get it, but you still have to understand that that's the source of what he's thinking about. And he's also thinking about, in this sort of notion of political equality and the family, the community, he's thinking about the nature of a Republican society. And if slavery is a radical injustice, how do you get rid of it? And his belief was that there had to be a Republican solution to it. That is to say that the people of Virginia, and he would think of Virginia as his country, certainly before the Revolution, and even after that, he probably has this idea, Virginia as his country. The white people, the white voters, those are the people who have to become enlightened to answer this question. He could not think that the question, or he would imagine that it would, but he could not countenance, I think, the idea that the solution would be what it actually turned out to be. That is a war. which ended the institution of slavery, and violence that ended the institution of slavery. He understood, I believe, and I think Peter agrees with me, very early on, that the people of Virginia in the 1780s and the 1790s and the 1800s during his lifetime were not going to vote to end slavery. That just was not going to happen. And he turned his energies towards the thing that was the animating part of his life, the animating source of his being and his understanding of why he was on earth, was his role in the American Revolution. As a person who had revolted, helped with the revolution against Great Britain, and had created a country. That's what obsessed Jefferson. We're obsessed with race, we're obsessed with slavery. I am, and I think rightly so in this time period, because this is how you have to understand the United States of America. But he was obsessed with the idea that he had started a country. And that is what he wanted to be he thought would be his legacy, why he knew he would be remembered, and that people would pay attention to this. But through his political life, through the founding of the University of Virginia, all of these things were done, he thought, to advance this notion of the American Revolution. Of course, now we know that slavery, the thing that he said, that's going to solve itself, it's an institution that's going to go away, people will become enlightened, they'll figure out that this is not the way to go. It's like anything in your life, you say, if we could just, that little thing over there, it will take care of itself. What I need to do is this, and then you find out that this thing over there is really the issue. And that thing over there that he thought he could manage by being the most blessed of the patriarchs, what we call a sort of an oxymoron, a benevolent slaveholder, that way of doing things was not going to cut it, that was not a way to get out of slavery, that was a way for more people to think that they were okay. I can do this the right way. But the notion of violence, the notion of the dissolution of the Union through violence and the end of slavery that way, that is not something that he would have contemplated. He thought that following the normal precepts of Enlightenment, science, we talk about how science, the notion of scientific progress influenced Jefferson's life. He sort of attached that to the notion of everyday world. You get to know things, you get better and better, as Peter suggested. We know more, we become better informed people, then we do the right thing. That's not an answer for us today, but that was the answer that he had.
It's not an answer for us, but it was, and I use this word advisedly, his prayer. And it was that successive generations would see more clearly, they would be progressively more enlightened. I think one simple formulation captures his faith or belief, and that is that Republican government is an engine for moral progress. Now, you might look around at our democracy today and say, really? But you have to put yourself in Jefferson's world, with the new American republics being the first in the modern world to be based in any way on the will of the people rather than dynastic succession and the rule of force. And this idea that once the people govern themselves, however ignorant they might be in the short term, it was going to be their world and they would begin to see the light. This is a beautiful faith. It's so easy for modern cynics to say when Jefferson believes in the future generations taking on this responsibility to perfect the revolution, to carry on the good work, he's just passing it off on somebody else. And they ask, why don't you do it? You have all the moral authority, Jefferson. This is the work you should be doing. But he says, as Annette was suggesting, I can't tell you, Americans, how you should vote in this election, though I probably could here in Brattleboro. It's not for me to tell you that I am the enlightened lawgiver. I'm Plato's king. I am gold. And that I tell you slavery must end, and that's the way it's going to be. What has happened to the very idea of a republic if that's what leads to the end of slavery? It has to be your decision, my Brattleboro. What do you call yourselves? I just lost it. It was going to be beautiful, my peroration.
Brian's
Brattleboro's?
Battle Bros.
Sorry, it was really, really, okay. Oh, brethren, thank you. We are in a place of worship. Brethren, it's up to you, and sisters too, to take this thing on. It is your moral responsibility. But that idea of the connection of politics to morality is, well, now it's particularly frayed and tenuous. We think, well, that is what we used to call a character, and we used to worry about that, but we're way past that. We're into the cynical calculations of what's going to work for us and what kind of vote coalitions can we form and so forth. But this dream of a republic that perfects itself in a world that is, from our perspective, nasty, brutish, and short, and I'm quoting a famous political philosopher, Virginia was a nasty place. America was a nasty place. Everybody smelled, they beat up on each other, physical punishment all over the place, alcohol intake 10 times what it is now. Don't romanticize that period. But you can look at the founders, and you can look at Jefferson, imagining, yes, it could be better. This is an era of refinement and politeness, civility, enlightenment, all of these values to create a better world. Well, they thought they set the stage. They laid down the challenge. And of course, that challenge was not met, as Jefferson realized. And so he lived in a, well, you might say a bubble of faith. Until his dying day. He would not admit to himself that we were not good enough for our own revolution.
Yeah, and he felt that. He came to believe that at the end. He had doubts about it from the very beginning. He'd left. He'd had a terrible time as governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War. And we talk about this in the book. I guess I should say we divide the book into 3 parts. It's not a conventional, cradle to grave chronological biography, but it follows roughly a chronological,
Against my better instincts.
Against your better instincts, but hey, Patriarch, where we talk about Virginia, home, all the kinds of things that influenced him, and then we talk about his time in France, in Paris, and when he goes to Paris, that's the time when he begins to wonder, maybe the Virginians really aren't up to this after his experiences as governor. And he goes to France and is transformed by the experience. He sees French society, he sees the French family, and he's sort of aghast at women, the role that women are playing in French society.
That's unnatural.
It's unnatural, this notion of
natural. What are you doing up here anyway?
What am I doing up here anyway talking, right? Women, out in the streets, he says, and the streets almost implies like they're prostitutes in a way, that they're out in the streets searching for pleasure instead of being back, forgetting what is left behind them in their nurseries, namely their children, that's what women were supposed to be doing. They were supposed to be taking care of the home. And all of the things that he's worried about in Virginia, about how they might not measure up, sort of pale in comparison. We might have problems here, but we're not like that. We're not like the French, and that gives him a different view of American society. It gives him a different view of slavery. We talk about the fact that while he's there, he has James Hemings and Sally Hemings, who are the half siblings of his late wife, Martha Wales. They had the same father, John Wales, and he begins to see slavery through the eyes of these people, the people who are in France, who are in a sort of quasi-free situation. France had, it was not free soil, but everybody who petitioned for freedom in Paris during the 18th century, it was granted. So it was pretty much a pro forma thing. You just went up and you were freed. You got your freedom papers. They declined to do that, so he was there with these people as enslaved people in Virginia, enslaved by Virginia law, but living in this sort of quasi-free state there, and he begins to see them as the face of slavery, and this is also something that sort of leads him to think that he can ameliorate the institution and make it something palatable, as I was referred to before. He was going to be the slave owner who did things differently. And he comes back to America and begins to work on what I said was his obsession, that is to say, making sure that the new American government was on its feet and on its way without being thwarted by the Federalists, thwarted by Alexander Hamilton and his people, who had a different vision of the American future. So there's a lot going on with this man that has been written about, but I think we write about it in a different way.
Right.
People have called it a sympathetic. I don't know that it's sympathetic. Other people, it's hard to say. We're either alternately trying to destroy Jefferson or to apologize for him. So it's hard to get the sense of what people want. But the idea is to have as honest a look as we could possibly muster.
His political enemies thought he went to France and turned French. Well, he never spoke French very well, and what really happened to him in France is he turned American.
Mm-hmm.
And he became an apologist and what you might call an early exceptionalist. And he said, what we now have in America should be a model to the world. The warts disappeared from view, the long view. And when he came back, he made his peace with that world, even while he sustained his belief that that world would improve. It had to. Mm-hmm. We can say then he's off on his fantasy trip. It's never going to happen. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But he became an American, and that's the Jefferson we present to you, an American. Find yourself in him, or find things in him that seem alien, but it's all about the legacy of the revolution, of the founding, of his generation to us today. And it behooves us to grapple with it. Mm-hmm. It's not all beautiful, it's not all great, but it's us.
Mm-hmm. And it's important.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, any questions?
You moderate your own?
Sure.
Sure. You could identify yourself. Well, you all know each other. It's a small town, right? Tony, you get the first question.
If I recall correctly, I think Madison freed his slaves at the end of his life, correct?
No.
No, Washington.
Monroe?
No.
Washington.
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 There had to be one.
There had to be one of them.
Do you believe, Kate?
Yeah, we can't hear you.
I'll repeat the question for him.
Yeah. Do you believe, okay, that had Jefferson been a better fiscal manager of his financial affairs, that he would resolve this dilemma he had, intellectual dilemma, and freed his slaves at the end? Really believe, okay, that he had this responsibility, okay, to care for them irrespectively?
I think if people didn't hear the question, he prefaced it by saying, noting that Washington freed his slaves, the slaves of his that he could free, not Martha's, dower slaves. Would Jefferson, if he'd been a better fiscal manager, freed all of his slaves at the end of his life? No.
No.
I don't think he would have, no.
That was easy. We could explain it, Tony, I think,
I don't think he would have. He believed that the solution, that emancipation had to be a society-wide thing, that the society as a whole, that it made people, individuals, feel good themselves to free the enslaved people. It would probably make the enslaved people feel free and feel good too. Just coincidentally. But no, he thought that this had to be something that the community as a whole had to grapple with. And as you know by the question, of course he died $107,000 in debt, which would be millions of dollars today, and those are assets in the hands of the executor. He could not, they could have called them back, anybody that he freed. But no, he would not have done that. And he wouldn't have done it because, I should say, parenthetically, he had a daughter. I'm not minimizing what Washington did, but Washington had, he had stepchildren and step-grandchildren, but the Custis grandchildren had the Custis estate. It's one thing to free your slaves when you know that your heirs are going to get hundreds of other slaves from somewhere else, versus freeing your slaves when that's all your children have. And that's what property is about. It's hard for us to think of property in people, but property is everything in Virginia at that time. And, even aside from the sort of, philosophical or political notion about we all have to get together and free them, I think just as a parent, it would have been hard for him to disinherit his daughter, whose husband failed and didn't have any property.
His slaves were mortgaged. So his daughter never got them anyway.
He's got some of them.
They were mortgaged.
She goes.
Well, no, but I'm just, we were talking about the hypo was if he were debt-free, if he had no problems, would he have done it? And I'm saying still no,
Well,
because he would have left Martha property.
and that's telling you the real story from within the family. Of course, the Custis's were not thrilled about what George was doing
No.
with their potential property. But I think this illustrates the radical's dilemma that a solution that makes you feel good might actually retard progress, relieving pressure towards some kind of global solution. When his young neighbor, Edward Coles, proposes to go to Illinois and free his slaves in the free territory of the Northwest, Jefferson says, I applaud your intentions, your motivations, because this is important work, but don't leave Virginia and don't free your slaves, because you have to work for the ultimate solution of emancipation of the entire enslaved class and expatriation. They have to be deported, sent elsewhere. This is the radical's solution, a solution so radical that it couldn't possibly happen. Yet it's what he held on. I keep emphasizing the faith, the belief. He believed in this. I've been saying this 40 years, he said 40 years after he wrote about it in the Notes in the State of Virginia. It's out there. I've made my solution clear to you. I'm waiting for, I'm praying for the day when you will see the light and follow this counsel, because that's the only solution. If you leave Edward Coles, then you've taken the light with you. You're, of course, the coincidental beneficiaries. Those enslaved people would say, this is great. This is the promised land. But what about the people they leave behind?
Mm-hmm. And, Coles, I should say, also follows the sort of trajectory of Jefferson as an elderly man by pretty much turning on African Americans and saying that the people that he freed shouldn't have been freed, and that he becomes an expatriation, that they should be expatriated to Africa. So there's this sort of thing where you have sort of youthful idealism, and then then it follows with sort of statements about it, and then by the time people are older, they all end up pretty much in the same place. They got to go.
You 60s radicals remember how impatient you were with
you? What are you
liberal.
talking about? Well, maybe you were a 60 radicals. You're not a radical, maybe.
Another question.
In the green?
My name is also Tony Atkinson. As you've been talking about Jefferson not freeing his slaves and not doing what might be needed to accomplish that, I've been wondering what parallels today might be. The word addiction is in my mind. I mean, it seems like Jefferson had a kind of addiction to the slaves, certainly on an economic level. I also think about the phenomenon of today, of global warming, and how easy it is for many of us to criticize people out there who want to dig more coal, have more coal power plants, do more fracking, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very easy to say, well, gee, it has to be a solution out there. A lot of us are still driving our cars and taking nice vacation trips in airplanes, which can also be seen as another form of addiction. I'm curious what thoughts you might have either about that issue or about the whole issue generally of disengaging ourselves in creative ways from societal attitudes that are destructive over a long period of time. It seems to me there's some parallels there. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah.
You alluded to it.
Many people did leave.
Oh, he was saying, what are things today that are somewhat like slavery, things that we do where we say, we recognize that they're bad, but we don't do anything about it ourselves to actually change it. He mentioned global warming, people driving cars, taking airplane trips, electricity. That's petroleum stuff. Everything you plug in your computer, all of it is from that. What are we doing that we could do better about?
Well, I think it's a wonderful question, and it's for us to contemplate. We focus so much on ourselves these days, and this is a secular version of redemption, that if we get right with what we eat and the energy we consume, then in some ways we've achieved a higher level of life, and we are extricating ourselves from the world. Our challenge is with our neighbors, you might say, and it's ultimately political. I think that is the problem. Yes, we like to think, and maybe it's true, that reform begins in the hearts of individuals and it eventually spreads, we hope contagiously, a good contagion, and then the will is there. But it's not clear, and I don't think any historian could tell you how it works. We could say about the anti-slavery movement that had some effect on destroying the Union in the lead up to the Civil War, that it was evangelical Christians who associated the state of their soul with the state of the nation and with the freedom of enslaved people. That's a powerful dynamic and inspiring combination. It's somewhat sobering to think that they actually had very little effect, except in the paranoid imagination of Southerners who destroyed their own union, which was working for them. But these are reflections, the kind of ironic, paradoxical reflections that we hate from historians. Since we're in pulpits, we need to say something more inspiring. And toward that end, I turn the podium over a pulpit.
No, I mean, I think you answered it well. I'm a bit more optimistic about individual choice as an example for people, to follow. I mean, we're not going to solve these crises, but I do think that it's worth contemplating, thinking about how can you criticize other people? How can you do that when there are certain things in your own life that you know better than? You have an intellectual belief that this is not the thing to do, but you do it. And that human tendency is there, and that's what makes, I think, history an interesting subject. I mean, it's not just about people that you like or people that you have all figured out, but it's about people who can raise those questions. The paradox, how do we do this? How do you believe one thing, say one thing, and do something else? Because of all of your other commitments to other people, you use the term addiction, the comfort level that you have. I talk about this in another of my books, about how Jefferson, when he's in retirement, sort of slavery provides him with positive benefits. He's a woodworker. He likes to build things. He monopolizes the time of John Hemings and other people doing things that he likes to do, and build, put things together, plan, that kind of thing. All of these things are, I don't call them addictions, but they're part of his life that he does not want to give up, that he did not want to give up. And it was very, very hard for him. And it made it it sort of dovetails nicely with his quote unquote political solution that we all have to do it together, because he knows that's going to be tough. That's going to happen after he's gone, and he's still going to get to build the stuff with John Hemings and, have the nice,
I thought you were going to be optimistic.
I thought I was going to get optimistic. You thought I was going to be optimistic. But that's the human condition. That's who we are. Now, it happens in a context that's particularly tough for us, thinking about slavery, but it happens it's a continuum of things where people do that constantly. In the back.
I'm curious how given that we all have that hypocrisy in us on various levels, how did you decide? You said at one point you called something, you tended to take him at his own word, and yet, like you just pointed out, his own word that the future would solve this. As soon as I heard it, it sounds like that's a convenient, explanation. So I have a two-part question. One is scholars, where did you decide to draw that line? I'm not buying it. And two, has personally had any reflections on your own, look at your own potential hypocrisies or insights into it?
Hey, that's not part of this discussion. This is about Jefferson. It's about me. How you decide when we're not going to take him at his word? When there's evidence that he knows better. When there's some other piece of thing because he sometimes says believe it or not, one thing to one person and something else to another person. What? That actually happens? So I think it's there when you have to, and this might not be satisfactory, you have to if you read a lot of Jefferson letters, you know that Jefferson, Jeff Looney, a guy who does the retirement series, is editing Jefferson's letters when he's in retirement. We're doing a project and we're calling it The Excitable Jefferson. And we're listing all the kind of, whenever we come upon really hyperbolic statements, exaggerated statements that Jefferson makes, this is the best cherry pie that's ever existed in the history of the world. That kind of thing, and I think he almost said that. Things like that are Jeffersonian exaggerations because you see him do this in other contexts. So that would be one where and again, it's a supposition, but it comes from the knowledge of the person and how he communicates. Second, if you know that he's saying something to one person that he said to another individual, and he's done things that are more in keeping with what he's saying to the one versus the other, then we don't take him at his word there. But otherwise, unless there's some reason some contrary evidence, if he says, we argued about whether or not he's a Christian, but he keeps saying that. He believes that, but it's on his terms, not on our terms, but on his terms. And the question is, can we accept it? So there's no alchemy, no special alchemy to this. It's not a science, but it comes from understanding the person's communication style.
Karen?
I'd like to ask a question about your collaboration. How long did it take to write the book together? And was it all done virtually, or did you end up having to do brainstorm sessions together in person? And then I have a question about the direction that this book took, away from the intellectual historian perhaps to the social. Was that embraced positively by your fellow academics, or with skepticism?
Well, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
Well, as far as we know, our fellow academics...
I'm sorry. You want to repeat the question?
The question... it's
She's asking about our collaboration.
About our collaboration.
And how long did it take?
Was the tilt away from, for me, intellectual to social history, and reverse for Annette? Is that confusing or upsetting our colleagues? I think I can safely say that our colleagues are fine with it. There's plenty here for you if you don't like him. And if you love him, there's plenty here for you. It's just we're not interested in that question particularly. I feel personally, and Annette can speak to her own engagement with this, that it's been wonderful for me to have the opportunity to get into the realm of what you might call speculative psychology, thinking about what moves him, because we do move beyond what he says, and we try to understand, and I think Annette was eloquent in talking about how France shaped his vision of America. That's something that's going on in his head, the way he processed things. And it's not to say that where Jefferson came out of that processing is a good place, that we endorse it, but it's interesting to observe. I feel that it's enriched my own engagement with scholarship, and perhaps, and this is part of your earlier question, how has it changed me? I don't know. It reinforces, but I come by this constitutionally, and you wouldn't believe it from my performance style, a sense of modesty, and we were just arguing about, really? We had a deep argument about original sin driving up from New York City last night.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, to answer the other parts of your question, it took us longer than it should have. Largely because
you were too famous.
Because I was, busy with other things. We started out with a series of conversations. We actually went out on the road and talked about the project before we actually got going for it.
Yeah, we had a pre-book tour.
We had a pre-book tour, and we did have brainstorming sessions. We got together. He was in Virginia, and I'm in New York and in Cambridge, and brainstorming sessions in person, brainstorming sessions on Skype. We had the best time, I think the most productive time, was when we were regularly Skyping. It was a great thing. to be able to talk to people face to face and see reactions and so forth. So that's how we did it. And as I said in the beginning, writing things out, having the other person take a look at it, and go back and forth like that. So it was collaborative in that sense. So it takes a lot of, well, I want to say sometimes you have to back down in ways. I can remember only one really tense moment. We were coming from Helsinki to Turin, and we're on a plane. And the tension was so thick, I can't
The plane nearly came down.
Remember who was doing what, but I think he may have been looking at pages that I had written and commenting on them and we were sort of sitting side by side and giving it back, and it became sort of monosyllabic at a point. Yep, sure, fine. And of course, yep, sure, fine. And you're on a plane, so you can't get up and go get a drink, water or step outside. So that was probably, when we talked about religion, arguing about that was different. This was a moment, because it was sort of at the end when you're about to turn in the manuscript. Because before you could say, yeah, sure, make that change, and then say to yourself, I'll fix it back later. I'll do it later, But this was over at that point. This was at the very end, and we survived that.
Yeah, we had some moments. But for me, I'm going to sound sappy yet again. It's all about friendship. That's the reason I collaborate. And when somebody wants to collaborate with me, and it's a way to build on that friendship. Mm-hmm. And yes, if you have a strong friendship, you can take the occasional bump. And it's good for you. Mm-hmm. You have to be reminded that though we have one voice and we really see things very much alike, we're still different persons. I mean, this is the whole challenge of we think of the whole democratic experiment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're different, but we can talk with each other, and that's what we've done in this book.
To that point, this is a question for the audience, and that is, why are you staying up Saturday night so late when you should wake up Sunday mornings at 5:45 and visit Peter on the radio on Backstroke? This is a great radio show, and I just want to say I'm a regular listener, very frequent listener, and the surprise to me is no matter what the topic is, Russians or King Oil or women in the workplace, the arc of race that goes through, this is the 18th century guy, there's a 19th century guy, 20th century guy. The arc of race, no matter what the sort of narrow glance is of history, it's an eye-opener. Yeah. And it's an eye-opener for us today as we're about to go into a political process, the arc of race. And I've studied history all my life, and it's always been episodic. The study of up to the Civil War and then up to the Civil Rights Movement. And we get our dose. But this collaborative history that you're talking about, we're seeing here today, and from that radio show, has taken the scales from my eyes as a citizen. And I just want to thank you. And I've got a question, but I've taken up too much.
Right, I would just say that working with Ed Ayers, my colleague on the show particularly, Brian's wonderful. I love those guys. But Ed never lets us forget that race is part of the story. And for me personally, in my own intellectual development, my relationship with Ed, and then the work I began to do on Jefferson before Annette and I really became close friends, but it was coterminous, actually. It was simultaneous. I was beginning to work on some of these problems of slavery, but knowing Annette and talking about things with her for more than 20 years now, I think I have a better understanding of things too, and it's been a real privilege for me to be in a moment in my discipline with the people I care about most, to be able to come to this understanding. So I've learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. And I have too. Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to try and put a couple of things together. It's so rich. I don't know how well I'll do, but here it is. From reading your book, Gordon, I understand that Sally Hemings chose not to become what is called a free black in France with the promise that Jefferson made to free her children. And what I want to link that together with is this idea about the benevolent patriarch. And what seems to be missing in all of this is what is blatantly obvious, which is that the country is founded on genocide, okay? That people who are different colored skin, they are, quote, savages. Now you have an enslaved group who are serving you either in a maternal role, and women are also in this patriarchal subjugation, and that the top down, that, you know, the men essentially are going to come to this realization is missing the cardinal point, which is that self-determination for and from people who were oppressed. I'm not hearing that in this discussion. Now, what is clear, I think, and I'd like you to make this more clear to me, is that Jefferson saw Sally Hemings not just as a bedmate, but as, in fact, a kind of shadow wife. I may be wrong about that, and please do set me straight. But that at least, at the very least, the humanization of that relationship was not just master and slave, that there was a humanity there and desire that equaled the playing field in a certain way. But I'm linking, in a sense, those two things. But the main and cardinal point is that the idea that to give up one's comfort, okay, he isn't willing to do that. We see that economically or emotionally or psychologically. But the idea that it's going to come down from on top from white males is essentially a flawed idea, because it isn't really giving power to those who are oppressed. That's exactly what we're seeing today. No different, same thing.
I think you're right. I don't think we say anywhere in the book or what we said here that Jefferson's vision was the right vision, because it obviously wasn't. I mean, it was not something that empowered women. It was not something that empowered African American people.
Really democratic.
It's, well, yeah, not from our perspective, certainly it's not, but from a time where he'd come from an era when property qualifications for voting, tremendous hierarchy, a hierarchical society, with males to females, white, upper class whites to poor whites, blacks, Native Americans, and all of that. No, I mean, this is not suggesting that his idea was right. No, it's not at all, not at all. Because, you know, obviously, we talked a little bit about, look at his understanding of Haiti, for example, where not African Americans, but Africans, Haitians in Saint-Domingue are fighting for their freedom. And at first, he thinks that's, they're gonna do that, and then eventually they'll take over the Caribbean, and this is the age of revolution, blah, 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 until they start killing white people. And then it's, well, that's different, because what we haven't had the chance to talk about much is the issue of race and white supremacy, and how that complicated his vision, that this was supposed to be a country, that there could be a white country and a black country. Blacks and whites would not be able to live together without conflict. If blacks, once emancipated, as they should be emancipated, should form their own country, then they would be able to meet the white country as on equals on that particular level, but not a multiracial society, because there would be violence. There would be conflict. Now, it may not have been violence the way he saw it, but there's certainly been conflict. And we, as Peter suggested, we congratulate ourselves if we think that things have not been, that he was entirely wrong about that. Because until you do something about the doctrine of white supremacy, I believe there's always going to be conflict. You'll never get past that.
But I think it underscores the need to think historically. I embrace all the values you've articulated so eloquently. But if you think historically, in Jefferson's time with him, you see a different challenge before you. The very idea that anybody could be equal to anybody else is a revolutionary idea. You establish that, and you can build on that. You can make those claims on behalf of people who've been marginalized and oppressed. It's not until the 20th century relativism and anthropology that you begin to think that all civilizations are created equal, and therefore that Native Americans in their savage state should be left alone in their world. The civilizing mission of white man is something we dismiss. Oh, that's horrible, that's terrible, that's genocidal. But that's according to the frame in which people looked at the progress of humanity. It's in stages, from the primitive stage of hunters and gatherers. It's moving forward to an agricultural and commercial and industrial society. That prospect of a glorious future is what motivates the Enlightenment people like Jefferson. And we now see the costs of that, what we have lost. But our challenge is to understand, first of all, we are privileged beneficiaries of modernity. We're not outside of it. And this is our history that we need to engage with. Oof.